cultural humility, I'm noticing that in the conversations, discussions about the cultural humility, especially in the context of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we may be missing a bit of the nuances and the connections that make this a real intervention. So within the realm of cultural humility, you can release yourself from the pressure of obtaining knowledge about different cultures. A more culturally humble approach is to accept that you do not know and seek to learn from the client individually about their coping tools, process of resilience, and protective factors. A long-term solution in this context is to review a path to becoming the person that is consistently demonstrating self-awareness, openness, ethical deliberation, self-reflection, and empathy. I would go over those again, but I'm going to leave those in a text message so that you can have those to look over. You've got to accept, I would even say it this way, I must accept that I can be wrong and take accountability for my choices. That's the core, including the long-term idea, the characteristics of cultural humility. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because these are interactions in practice. We don't just apply cultural humility to the therapeutic interaction or apply it to clients. We actually apply cultural humility. If we're going to apply it, it's applied to ourselves. This idea is that we must emotionally connect and internalize humility. That's openness that is characterized by mindfulness, self-awareness, and a foregoing of our own self-protection to be vulnerable enough to connect with the experience from the other person's point of view. This is also called empathy. Empathy is about, well, it isn't about you hearing enough of the client's story to feel bad for them. That's called sympathy. Empathy is you entering the conversation, respecting another point of view, ready to converse with the pain another person is feeling, regardless of whether you feel that pain or not. Conversing doesn't mean that you agree or that you take their point of view, but your job isn't to fix it. That's critical. Your job is to listen and facilitate the most sustainable choice behavior by the client. And that choice behavior gets into what I said earlier, this idea that they have these coping tools, process of resilience, these protective factors that they've already been exercising, and you want to get to those. That's why you're listening so intently. You're not pushing your views upon them, but more specifically, you're looking for their protective factors, their coping skills, what they've done in the past. Now, empathy is a method of the larger theory of emotional intelligence. And so EI methods include emotional awareness, self-regulation, emotion management, social skills, as well as empathy. Critical elements, these are very critical elements because they support the skills of leadership, parenting, social action, and individual change. The best leaders, the best parents, the best social activists, the best people are the people who integrate and demonstrate a great deal of emotional intelligence. And recognize that I talked about that as the theory of emotional intelligence, and these methods of empathy, self-regulation, emotional awareness, emotion management, social skills. That's important because we want to understand the progression of theory, method, modality, technique. I want you also to recognize the connection between the methods I just talked about with emotional intelligence and the methods we talked about with cultural humility. They're virtually the same. So the connection is very clear. This is really important when you start to talk about let's say it's a signature assignment or an exercise that you're engaged in. in an educational environment or a simulation environment where you're talking about topics of the importance of diversity and intersectionality. You're talking about equity and inclusion. You're trying to conceptualize anti-racist and anti-oppressive approaches, or simply demonstrating cultural humility. If you're tasked with doing any of those, you're going to need to understand emotional intelligence. If you miss the vulnerability that comes with emotional intelligence, you'll miss the point of listening with cultural humility. You're in danger of thinking that you're here to fix rather than comprehending your role to bear witness and to facilitate mutual healing. That mutual healing, I think that gets me excited because those are the areas that I am really interested in, that deal with interventions like restorative justice and mediation. Solutions are not exclusive to protesting and policy advocacy. That's important, but that's not the only thing. Solutions must include coalition building, social engineering through entrepreneurships, and I'm talking about building out nonprofits and even for-profits that are in the not only cultural humility space, but in the equity and inclusion space that really practice these anti-racist and anti-oppressive approach. So the coalition building, social engineering, and intentional research to practice and practice to research cycles. I think it's really critical to, number one, look in the notes for a mutual healing literature review, but also recognize that what I'm talking about, the language that I'm describing here, is the language of social work accreditation. This is where this rubber meets the road in the practice and demonstration, not just of, as I said, cultural humility, but really what it means to operationalize diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-racist policies. So a couple of other things that are important in this realm to discuss are the ecological implications. And that's actually where you saw these paradigms of the ecological levels of application, and with cultural humility or the cultural orientation paradigm that you saw versus the oppression/power-based paradigm that you saw. The cultural orientation is an application at the micro-meso level. So that's dealing with the individual and moving outward into families, groups. The oppression and power-based paradigm is application at the meso-macro level. The point is that the social worker, the true social worker, engages with cultural humility on both of those levels and within themselves. And I say both of those levels, meaning macro, meso, macro, but you recognize that that's potentially 4 different areas, 3 different areas, but the interactions is another full discussion we should have. The interactive effects is where you make the change. So thinking of it as micro to meso and meso to macro, and then the individual within themselves, that's the 3 areas. Last thing I want to talk about, I thought it was pretty interesting, and it is critically important that you distinguish between personal identity and cultural identity. And so your perception of your life events, your beliefs, your values, your behaviors, and the norms that you adopt from the communities that you come from, that's your personal identity. Your cultural identity provides a frame and influence on your personal identity. And you get that from the list of diversity terms like religion, sexual orientation, gender. Those are cultural definitions. But what you adopt and how you engage, that's the personal piece. So the critical difference here is this idea of perception. Your perception is always personal. It's influenced by the outside, but it's a choice that you are presented with That is the critical element in all of our interactions. And I'll hit this again, but I want to let you know that choice is what you're really modeling when you're working with clients. You're looking to predict that choice based on the available factors, the profile of the individual, and the context they're in, the environmental influences, and then you want to influence that choice toward more sustainable behaviors that fit with the goals that the client has outlined. So choice is critically important. You can only get to choice if you look at the context of cultural identity, but truly identify personal identity, because that's going to indicate the choice behavior. For more on that, that's all, well, a great deal of that is behavioral economics. So you're looking at the choice architecture that's created, and then the choices that people make, the behaviors that come out of that. Your cultural identity is a bunch of boxes that other people can check because they can see certain things, they can ask you certain questions about where you come from. But you personally interpret those boxes to create behaviors. That's critical. This becomes a critical distinction, again, as we discuss privilege, and more importantly, the prediction of someone's behavioral choices. In practice, this means that we don't just assess our biases and privileges or privilege as social workers. We're working to overcome our bias and privilege. We can lay all of that down. It's not that we have to have biases and privilege. We can forego that in the context of what I was describing earlier, the vulnerability that's required in your engagements with clients and really, truly with society as we grow and evolve as people. The difference between assessing our biases, kind of knowing what's going on with us, and overcoming them is a very different activity. Overcoming is more like openness, mindfulness, self-awareness, action that demonstrates those characteristics, i.e. cultural humility, right? Emotional intelligence, sound familiar? Assessment is what you see many clients who are stuck doing. They're doing great assessment. They read the books, they attend the motivational speakers, they even come to therapy, but they haven't internalized and emotionally connected with the change that needs to be made systematically in daily life. That's where the opportunity is. If you can bear witness and facilitate that recognition, the application of that knowledge within the framework of an emotionally intelligent opportunity, you can create lasting change, not only for those individuals, but that's where the ecology fits in. If that individual gets better, their family gets better, their groups and neighborhoods that get better, those neighborhoods influence cities and policies within states, and those states impact the federal level, and groups, organizations, and communities benefit from that development of emotional intelligence, cultural humility at the individual level. All right, thank you for your time and attention. This has been Dr. Michael A. Wright, the Pivot Coach, today engaging with Social Work Next. Socialworknext.com is coming soon. Look for it, socialworknext.com.